Buenas noches, good evening. I'm Dr. Marta Moreno Vega, President and creator of Creative Justice Initiative. That is the organization presenting the dialogues that are happening across the nation, together with Josue Perea, who is the director of Afro-Latin Forum. And why are we doing these conversations? And we're clear we're living in a historic moment, right? Every day is a historic moment, but there are certain issues that present themselves that make the moment extraordinary and places us in a situation where we question ourselves, we question our ethics, our values, and what positions we take in the work that we do as activists, as people who are concerned about our racial issues, our justice issues, and our legal issues. So that I am excited about this panel because we postponed it in honor of the students taking a position at the University of Texas. And we are honored that the sisters that are you will be introduced to have agreed to be part of this very important discussion. The topic is Afro-Latinx now. And I introduce you to our co-producer of these events, Josue Perea, director of Afro-Latin Forum.
Thank you so much, Dra. Marta, and thank you everyone for joining us. And we're really glad, and we're really thankful and glad to join with Creative Justice Initiative for these series of conversations. And this one, Afro-Latinx Now, for Latinx is Now, Dialogues on Law, Education, and Diaspora, is a really important conversation. Comes at a really key moment, as we've shared in different conversations in the different moments, and as La Doctora Marta just shared, that it comes at a really key moment in our struggle, in our struggles for Black liberation and for liberation across the diaspora. And why was it important for us to host this conversation? Right, it came as La Doctora said. We wanted to be in support to allow for focused action by the students, to allow for focused action by the professors, all of whom are on this panel, who are really supporting their students in the way that they want to see liberation play out in this country and in the world. And the conversation, these dialogues that we're having today by this distinguished panel is going to be very important for us to really converse about what are the lines that cross between education and law, and how does that affect us as Afro-Latinas here in the United States, but also as people of African descent throughout the globe and throughout the hemisphere. So what we hope that you're able to take away today is the importance of these dialogues and these conversations. And what we hope is that this conversation today is one that encourages you to have other conversations and further discussions and look for more information on what changes we all need to collectively do in order to really fight for liberation for people across the globe. Specifically, we focus in this conversation just for Afro-Latinas here in this country, but also across the diaspora, as we're affecting as people of Africa's descent across the world. And so we're thankful that you're here. We face many different challenges. We face many different time commitments. And so we're glad that you're able to join for this conversation. And now I want to pass it over to La Doctora Josiana Arroyo Martinez. Dr. Josiana Arroyo Martinez is a literary and cultural studies scholar who specializes in the analysis of Afro-diasporic literatures and cultures of the Americas. And she will be introducing the rest of our panelists today. Thank you so much, Dr. Josiana.
Yeah, thank you, Josue. And thank you, Dr. Marta Moreno Vega, and thank you, Josue Perea, for inviting us to be here. I'm really glad and humbled to be in the company of my colleagues, friends, scholars of Afro-Latinx studies. The University of Texas Austin is a Hispanic serving institution. We got that title a couple of years ago only, even though we have been serving the Hispanic and Latino and Black communities of Texas for ages. This is the largest public institution in the state. And we have a cohort of scholars in Black studies who specialize in Afro-Latino areas. And this is just, exciting for me because even though we're in the same department, we don't talk to each other as much because we're extremely busy every day. We also, as Dr. Marta Moreno Vega and Josue mentioned, we want to join this conversation along with the struggle of our own students at the University of Texas, and in and supporting the claims for liberation. Many of these colleagues are also activists, and we are going to be discussing their points of view on law, education, and what is happening, particularly with diversity, with Blackness, with critical race theory, but also with the current protests in the United States. So I'm going to read their biographies really quickly, and then I'm going to start posing questions. We want to leave 30 minutes at the end of the discussion to bring questions from the audience. So if you have your questions, please pass them down. So I will start with Dr. Monica Jimenez. She is a poet and a historian. Her research and writing explores the intersection of law, race, and empire in Latin America and the Caribbean. Her book, Making Neverland, Race and Law in the Creation of Puerto Rico, which offers a legal history of race and exception in the relationship between the U.S. and Puerto Rico, was just published by the University of North Carolina Press. I truly recommend it. Dr. Jimenez has received many fellowships in support of her scholarship from the Institute of Citizens and Scholars, previously the Woodrow Wilson Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the Mellon, and the Institute for Global Law and Policy at Harvard School of Law. In 2021, she was named an inaugural fellow of Letras Boricuas by the Flamboyant Arts Foundation. Her scholarly and creative writing, particularly her poems, have been published in WSQ, in Women's Studies Quarterly, a Latino Studies, Central Journal, and Sex Salon, among other publications. Dr. Daniel Cleland, to my right, is a political scientist and associate professor of Mexican American and Latino Studies with a courtesy appointment in the Department of African and African Diaspora Studies. She earned her PhD from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and her work highlights Black solidarity struggles and voices throughout interdisciplinary lens. Her research examines racial politics in the Caribbean and the U.S., a research path influenced by her personal connection to the Caribbean and her life as a Black Puerto Rican in the many spaces of the U.S. Her current project focuses on political attitudes and identity among Afro-Latinos in the U.S. and racism and Black consciousness in the Spanish-speaking Caribbean. Her book, The Power of Race in Cuba, Racial Ideology and Black Consciousness During the Revolution, was published by Oxford University Press in 2017 and won the Best Book Award for the Race, Ethnicity, and Politics section of the American Political Science Association and the W.B. Du Bois Distinguished Book Award from the National Conference of Black Political Scientists. Her book outlines the ways that Black consciousness and solidarity movements born out of experiences of marginalization have challenged structural racism and the narratives that support it. She's working on a volume with her colleague Devin Spence Benson on oral histories of Black Cubans in the U.S. Right now. Welcome, Danielle. Welcome, Monica. And we have also Dr. Jasmine Irizarry, who is an associate professor of African and African Diaspora Studies at UT Austin, and she's the founding director of the Numbers for Justice Lab and the Institute of Urban Policy and Research and Analysis here at UT. She earned her MA and PhD in sociology from Indiana University. She is a quantitative sociologist, race scholar, and survey methodologist, a leading expert in the emerging field of quant crit. Her research focuses on the critical study of race and racism within 4 overlapping areas of inquiry: kinder to high school schooling context, categorizations of identity and ascription, social attitudes, prejudice and discrimination, and justice and marginalization and social control. A lot of this work considers the complex landscape of race, ethnicity, immigration, class, and place, intersectionalities, experiences, and how they are linked to systems of power in educational settings. Her scholarship has been published widely in top-tier journals like Educational Researcher, Social Science Research, Sociology of Race and Ethnicity, Race and Justice, Race and Social Problems, Crime and Delinquency, and Journal on Homosexuality. Also, she is a public scholar who has been working. I mean, her voice has been, she has been published in Inside Higher Ed, PBS, Washington Post, and many other venues. So welcome. As you see, these are amazing, amazing colleagues and scholars. So they have a lot to say about the topics that interest us today. So I'm going to start with this guiding questions that I put together. Some of these questions are going to change and move a little bit to the current issues we have experienced, particularly in the last 2 weeks at UT. But I want to start with first, with your areas of research. You're 3 Afro-Latinas, Afro-Caribbean women, Afro-Puerto Rican, being born in the United States. How your life and background has informed your research, and in many ways how your knowledge, not only biographically, but your experiences in general, at school, in life, have kind of like work within your research paradigms. So let's start with these 2 big ones to talk a little bit about yourselves, and then we move. Jasmine, do you want to start? And then we're going to move. Yes.
Okay, I'm ready. Hi, everybody. So I guess one of the ways I can start is by thinking about the way an understanding of myself has unfolded over time in history in my own family, thinking about it as someone who's both Dominican and Haitian, and the complexities of that relationship and the way that actually shaped my engagement with being Haitian rather than just Dominican. I did not learn French. A lot of that was hidden in my family, especially because my mother was a refugee who moved from Haiti to DR and had to hide that herself when she lived in the Dominican Republic before she arrived to the US. So my own history is one of constantly discovering things about myself, about who I am, and having to continue reconcile with that. I think another part of it is that I came from a space where I, in some ways, was still normal. I grew up in Newark, New Jersey, in a kind of like maybe Pan-Caribbean, Black Caribbean space. And everyone, I felt normal. I felt like I fit, and I felt like everyone that was there was seen. And then I realized we were not seen. I read all these things that I found interesting and could not see myself. I could not see people I knew. I could not see my family in the work I was reading, in the histories that they told, in the research. And as someone who started out in STEM and kind of moved into the social science areas, you most definitely didn't see anything. And that really shaped my attention to invisibility. And what does it mean to be invisible? What does it mean to use numbers and measurement to make visible? And how do we do that? And how do we ground that in our own understandings of self and others, and also in understanding of how we can bring that to social science work in trying to challenge the invisibilizing of course, Afro, Black Latinos, but also of other populations who also are similarly invisibilized in the work.
Thank you. Danielle, Monica, who wants to go? Danielle, you want to go? Or Monica?
Sure, happy to go.
Yeah.
So I also grew up in the Northeast, excuse me. I also grew up in the Northeast. I grew up in between the Bronx and Mount Vernon. And that's also a very kind of Afro-Caribbean space. But I think I've had many moments in my life where I've had to kind of grapple with race and with Blackness. And I've always identified as a Black woman. But my mother did not identify as Black, right? Being Puerto Rican, growing up Puerto Rican, even though she was darker than I am. And so I think that, for me, studying Blackness among Caribbeans and studying race among Caribbeans means that we also have to kind of understand what the complexities are and how they work, right? Because my mother was never distancing herself from Blackness, right? She listened to Black music. She wore an afro. right? Her, you know, her social circle was Black. So it wasn't about distancing. It was really about not identifying, because that's not how she was socialized to identify, right? And Puerto Rico, you know, being Puerto Rican was seen as something separate from being Black, right? And so that's really a lot of what I think all four of us, right, are trying to, you know, challenge with our work to, you know, help folks understand that when we're talking about U.S. Latinos, U.S. Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, right, whatever the subgroup, that this is not separate from Blackness, right? And these are the same conversations that we're having around the census, right? That we have to be able to separate race and ethnicity. And so, you know, I grew up as a Black Puerto Rican in New York. And then when I moved to Miami, all of a sudden, I was no longer recognized as Latina because I was too dark. And so that, I would say that moment really kind of made me want to start thinking about Blackness and Latinidad in the US, whereas before I was mostly doing my work in the Caribbean. But it was just fascinating to me to be in this space where Latinidad, right, was coupled with whiteness. And I was not recognized as being Puerto Rican. And we all know, if we travel to the Spanish-speaking Caribbean, most people, right, are Afro descendants. So it was really this very strange contradiction. And then, you know, in political science, I would say social sciences in general, we treat Latinos as one group, right? We treat whites as one group, Latinos as one group, Black folks as one group, Asians as one group, Native Americans. And we're not disaggregating Latinos by race. And so when we're talking about outcomes as far as education, as far as criminal justice, income, home ownership, whatever it is we're talking about, we're grouping very white Latinos with very dark Latinos. And they do not have the same experiences. They are not racialized in the same ways. And so, you know, for decades, we have been doing research, we as in the fields, right, have been doing research that's inaccurate. And so really what I try to do with my research, and what we all try to do, is to kind of scream, we have to start paying attention to racial difference among Latinos, because if we don't, we're not analyzing this data correctly at all. And that becomes hard, right? Because of the complexities I talked about earlier, right? Not everybody identifies in the same way. Not everybody is used to thinking about themselves as Black, right? If they're not African-American. And so there's a lot of messiness that we have to sort through. But it's worth it, because we have to really start to understand how race works among Latinos.
Thank you. Monica.
Hello, everyone. This is such a fun conversation, and it is fun talking to my colleagues in this forum. I love, Yasmin, I love that you said constant discovery, right? Because I think in part, that's what we're all doing, right? We're on a journey of constant discovery, or we should be, right? So we should be thinking about both our research and our scholarship and our lived experiences that way. I had a radically different experience from both of you, which is I was born in Puerto Rico, and my family moved to Houston, Texas, when I was a child. And in the 90s, to be Latino in Houston meant to be Central American, really Mexican, right? Like that was the term, the identifier for anyone with a Spanish surname, we'll say. But I didn't obviously look Mexican, right? In the sort of phenotypical way that people assumed Latinidad appeared in Houston, Texas in the 90s. So my sort of discovery of race, right, was of this kind of flummoxed question of, but I don't understand, because you have this kinky hair, right? And this is in the 90s, before we had great products for curly hair, right? And we all walked around with like frizzy hair. And so it just really boggled people. And it was interesting because sometimes that sort of curiosity and that frustration with not being able to sort of identify me manifested in kind of violent, aggressive ways, right? People being like, but you don't sort of conform to what I expect. And there weren't that many of us from the Caribbean, from Puerto Rico, from Cuba, from the Spanish Caribbean, in Houston at that time. And in fact, you know, a future research project I have is about this kind of first wave of Puerto Ricans in Houston in the mid 80s, of which my family was a part. So for me, that move from Puerto Rico to Houston was traumatic, right? It was traumatic for all the reasons that migration is traumatic, but also because then I was sort of forced to then contend with this. I'm not normal, right? I love that you both were like, no, it was real normal to be like Black and Puerto Rican and, you know, in New York, in the Northeast, right? That wasn't my experience. And so to the question of discovery, right? I think part of the reason I'm a historian and I study what I studied, I write about Puerto Rico, is because I went into a mode of discovery from an early age. I wanted to understand myself, right? And what it was to be Puerto Rican. And of course, I went looking for all the like literature, you know, and I found all the stuff about New York Puerto Ricans. And I was like, well, clearly I'm in the wrong place. I should have been in New York, right? That's where Puerto Ricans are. What am I doing in Houston, Texas, right? So it was always like this tension I had about not fitting in, not even being a proper Puerto Rican, right? Because I wasn't in New York and I wasn't in Puerto Rico. I was in this like weird southern city. So in some ways, that's really the genesis of the research, right? Is trying to understand. And for me, that took the road of history. So I'm a historian. I'm a legal historian. I'm trained as an attorney as well. And my first training was as an attorney. And what drew me to law school was that I was questioning, well, what is Puerto Rico to the U.S., right? What is this thing? How do we get this status? What does it mean, right? What is this status? And I will confess that, you know, I wasn't really interested in that question. It didn't even dawn on me until I was in college and went to Puerto Rico and was like, wait, this is a part of the U.S., but this doesn't make sense, right? And when I started to kind of query that and investigate that from a legal perspective, race was front and center, right? It was right there. And I was like, why aren't we talking about this, right? If this is the fundamental sort of question that concerned everyone when Puerto Rico became a part of the U.S., why are we not talking about race in this dynamic anymore? Why isn't race sort of central to these discussions? And so for me, that was really the genesis of all the work that's come since, is really thinking about Puerto Ricans as race colonial subjects, right? And the way that the U.S. has historically and contemporarily understood the racial dynamics of Puerto Ricans and the racial sort of identification of Puerto Ricans. And what that has meant, to Danielle's point about the complexity that we live with, right? And how those things sort of conflict, sit uncomfortably with each other, and manifest in all of these various ways. So I'll stop there.
If I could just hop in, I just want to mention one thing. This is so interesting. So my last name is Puerto Rican, and that's because my father's father's Puerto Rican, but you'll never hear me mention that. And I think this is so interesting, this complexity of even that, because my father was the kind of rejected child to stay with a Dominican mother. And so I was rejected by my Puerto Rican family, who was much lighter than us. And so I did not grow up Puerto Rican. I grew up more like Dominican, but even Dominican in a Black pan space rather than like a Dominican and Puerto Rican space. And so it's just, even in these conversations, thank you for bringing that up, like just what it means to be in a space and the complexity of it. As much as I'm saying that I was normal in the sense that I saw people like me, there were also the complexity of people go, oh, so you're Puerto Rican because they see Irizarry. And I'm like, that's like my father. I have to I distance it. I'm like, that's what my father's father. And it is, in fact, my father's father, who I never met, who went to Dominican Republic and was remarried, and who I don't have a connection to, but I have a whole family, a whole side of a family is Puerto Rican that I'm not connected to. But that lived not that far from me. So it's complicated in thinking about that. I appreciate that, because the conversation about race is both in thinking about place, but also kind of the interaction of race and different groups and how that plays out among Latinos, like in these spaces, even like in the Northeast among.
Yes. And even within Caribbean spaces, right? You see how, you know, if you decide for Dominicanidad, what happens to your Puerto Rican side? You know, like, you know, all those hierarchies that still permeate even Caribbean discourses, right? Within. No, thank you. Thank you very much. So Danielle mentioned the recent change in the race and ethnic categories in the census, and this is going definitely to bring another layer, right, and complexity to the ways Blackness is read, even within Latino communities. I mean, and maybe for many of us, it's a way of displacing Blackness. And I mean, by creating this umbrella of Latinidad, I mean, that once again whitewashes and erases all of us. And Jasmine mentioned visibility and the fact that Afro-Latinos are always struggling, Afro-Latinx identities are always struggling with this dilemmas of visibility and invisibility. So I want you to talk a little bit about that, and what do you think this is going to bring to already the legal and social and educational challenges that we're seeing today within Latinx and Afro-Latinx communities in general. And many of you, particularly Jasmine, work with racial identification, even in the classroom, you know, with mostly with Dominican students. So, I mean, if you can comment on that, I mean, what are some of the challenges and why? I mean, we know as scholars why they're making this decision now and imposing this in our communities. It's very politically driven. So I want your insight in that, into that.
Yeah, so I mean, you know, Yasmin and I spent a good part of the summer and beyond arguing with folks about this decision. And you know, the thing is that we're not only arguing, you know, to prove our point with OMB, you know, or with the census. We were also fighting with Latino organizations, right? National Latino organizations, because the invisibility, right, that a lot of us experience are within our own ethnic groups. And so even though there was some willingness, right, to listen to our arguments, ultimately, right, as you said, Josiana, it's political. And so, you know, if non-Black Latinos seek to benefit from a particular decision, then, right, that's the decision that's going to be supported. And so, you know, it's difficult to, you know, to really defend a group, right, that is in the minority. And I think that, you know, as far as our research is concerned, we're going to have to really push, you know, for, I think, awareness campaigns, really push for folks to identify as Black and Latino in the census, you know, and ultimately, you know, our research will suffer because, right, it's likely that we're going to be undercounted because, as I said, right, there is a lot of messiness, there is a lot of complexity. And so a lot of times when people don't have to make the choice to choose a race, they're not going to, because it makes them think about things that they're either not used to thinking about, don't necessarily want to think about, or the categories that are provided on the census don't necessarily match with the way that they think about race. You know, so a lot of the research I'm doing right now is asking race questions in different ways, because essentially what we have on the census doesn't make sense to a lot of Latinos, right? So if we don't have these categories that we all use, right, like mestizo, like mulatto, like trigueño, like moreno, if we don't have those terms, then folks end up either picking Black, white, or something else. And it often doesn't, or they don't answer it at all, right? Which is why I think we're going to have this undercount as far as race is concerned. Because if folks can just put Latino and call it a day, then that's going to be easier for them, because these categories don't match with the way that we think about race because of our home countries, right? And the way that we have come up thinking about race as, right, more categories than just Black and white. And so I think, you know, there's going to be a lot of difficulty as far as the research is concerned. And so we really, at this point, right, the decision has been made. And so we have to really try to build awareness, improve testing. You know, Yasmin can talk more about, you know, the coding and the testing, right, and all of that. But I think that ultimately, you know, we have to push folks to identify with a race and an ethnicity, especially for Black Latinos, because, you know, as it is, we already have, right, an undercount. There's far more than 1.8%, right, of Latinos that are Black in the US.
This is so interesting. This is such a complicated question because I will share a personal tidbit. When I get a combined question, I opt out of Latinidad every time. Every time. Opt out of it ethnically. I will not fill it in. I will not check it. I will not even answer an open box if I know my blackness will be erased, period. Because I mean, that's a personal choice. So this is hard, right? Because we're talking now about a decision that has imposed multiraciality on something that is not, and that is homogenized a complexity among even Afro-Latinos. Like people Afro-Latino and they don't even understand. That could include, my children, third generation who don't speak Spanish. That can include someone whose mother's mestizo and father's Black American and mother's mestizo Mexicana, right? That can include somebody who both parents are Black from Panama or Dominican Republic. It can include so many different configurations. It can include somebody that simultaneously Latino and also qualifies for reparations if we ever reach that point in the United States, right? And so there's so many complexities to this, and the kind of like even talking about Afro-Latinos and then grouping and identifying is hard because the count will homogenize. In essence, it will, by the very nature of how they've constructed it. And for some people, the work will be around trying to still get the count, and for others there's a politics. And I'll say that's my personal politic, and it's not something that I tell everyone this is what they must do, but that's something that I choose, and I do it with my children too. We opt out of Latinidad every time because there's already immense amount of erasure of Blackness, and Latinos are already often erased from Blackness in numbers and ways that affects education. I mean, education is pervasive. I can explain about that in a little bit, which is why I think maybe I stand where I do, because I've already see the implications of this in an area that was already a carve out from the previous changes. And so the kinds of things we're going to see in the future, I've already been seeing in education for a while in the way it's measured. So it's difficult because even among us, we'll have to have conversations about what does it mean to do activism on the ground to get counts, and to navigate a system that has taken a question that was already not great and made it ever more complicated and unfair and homogenizing, and which we will have to find ways of still getting people counted so that we can advocate for communities, identify issues, and ensure resource allocation and voting rights, right? And so there's some major issues that are on the table with this. At the same time that we're dealing with the major politics of what it means to tell somebody to do something like checking both. Like I personally stand on the fact that I am not multiracial. Mm-hmm. And so these are like things that are complicated in that way, but absolutely are going to require us to do a lot of work. Yes, to ensure folks are seen in a moment where people are increasingly being erased.
No, that's so important. And Danielle mentioned something that is very very central to Texas, is that usually Latino organizations are pushed against Black and African American organizations and groups, because historically they have been doing that for generations. And in relation to that, and Monica mentioned the fact of Puerto Rico as a colony of the United States. I was wondering how, Monica, for you as a historian, how do you bring not only your legal expertise, but also forms of decolonial teaching, decolonial perspectives, either in relation to race, to gender, into the classroom? And I mean, and you are a historian, but you also work with a lot of contemporary data. I mean, you go in through the archives, but your research moves into the Puerto Rico in the present. You know, the world post Maria, neoliberalism, etc. So it's kind of like we have the archives and then we have the numbers, the statistics, but we need to go back to this terms, trigueño, mulato. I mean, terms that we also, deconstruct as scholars. We problematize as scholars as well, but now we understand that we need them for this data. I mean, I want you to kind of like, Monica, to kind of take on that and tell me what you think. on mute. There's a little, do you see the, okay.
Sorry, my cursor
Oh,
disappeared and I couldn't find it. I'm so sorry. I'm so tech challenged today. My deepest apologies to everyone. So I think this is a really interesting question and something that I spent a lot of time in the classroom talking about. I just finished a class this semester on Afro-Latin America. So really thinking about the history of Black folks in Latin America. But of course, because I'm a Caribbeanist, we spent the bulk of the class really thinking about the Caribbean. And because our communities in the Caribbean are so migratory, we spent pretty good chunk of that, right, talking about the migrations to the U.S. and the kind of, you know, choque of those notions of race and racial identification. And so I think what I find really interesting in the classroom, and so again, you know, I don't work deeply with data like my colleagues do, but obviously their work facilitates my work, right? I can sort of talk about these things because they've done the data crunching and shown us the way that these things have manifested. So one of the things that we did recently that was really eye-opening for them was thinking about the numbers of Black folks in Argentina and the way that those numbers sort of shifted over time, and then really thinking about the why of that, right? So the question of how we define race within official government documents and how that manifests in the way that people understand who is in that society, right? Like, so, you know, we've all heard this kind of like, oh, you know, Argentina is a very European sort of culture, right? And it harkens back to, you know, there's Italian influence and Spanish influence. And so that, you know, the numbers help us construct these narratives, right, about who we are. And so one of the things that I'm really keenly aware of in my teaching is thinking about, one, the way law structures our understanding of those narratives, right? And the way that law facilitates those narratives, and the role of government produced documents in those narratives. So I'm thinking about the way that in Puerto Rico, the question of race wasn't a question on the census, right? Like you were Puerto Rican and there was no question of until very recently. And once those questions were reintroduced, then there was the public education campaign that Danielle was talking about, right? We have to teach people why it's important to say, no, actually, I am Black. And what that means, right? The kind of deeper political, legal implications of that, community level implications. And also, you know, historical implications. So I think it's a really interesting and salient discussion. It's fraught, right? Because when we talk to our elders and we talk to our parents, right, like those conversations are difficult for people to have. I'm thinking about this recent work that Yariman Bonilla and Isaac Goudreau did, where they were asking, they were doing this sort of survey about politics and how people vote and this question of, you know, statehood and how they understood that. And they tacked on this question about race, right? Like, how do you racially identify? And this was, I think, in 2016. And so a lot of people were like, oh, I'm Latino, or I'm, you know, they had a really hard time answering the question. They were like visibly uncomfortable when they had to answer it. And this was in Puerto Rico, right? So the question that they were asking is, well, how did this happen, right? Like, how do we get to this place where people are like, oh, I'm Latino, or I'm Hispanic, or I'm whatever, but not really thinking about racial identity, not even in the ways that we thought about it, right? Trigueño, Moreno, Jabao, whatever the various categories that you might have used. And so their study is, I think, really fascinating. And ultimately, they're arguing that US-made media has played a huge role in the way that youth now identify. But I think what it demonstrates, right, is the malleability of these identities, and the way that they're not, of course, we know they're not fixed, but even the things that we aren't necessarily aware of are impacting how those identities are shifting and being manifested for us. So I think, you know, to your point, Danielle and Yasmin, about like, these actually are really thorny and like present conversations. You know, it's I don't know if it's unintended consequences, right? That's the generous reading, right? But but there's some real high stakes questions that it raises, right, for our communities. And the work becomes ever harder when you are sort of further obfuscating what is already a very difficult conversation for a lot of people to have.
Yes, thank you. So the three of you are activist scholars and who have been really invested in supporting students in the present protest against the war, the divestment camps that have started in UT, but also you have been really present in the debates that are ongoing in Texas against SB 17 laws. And what is happening with our with DEI, right, in Texas. I mean, and this is, as Marta was saying to me a couple of weeks ago, this is a national conversation, but I really wanted your point of view on Texas. And I mean, recently, just yesterday, we had students in the Capitol discussing, crying, right, and telling how this impact of this terrible loss have really, I mean, framed negatively their education. I mean, many students in the University of Texas are first generation students, as we are. I mean, at least I am a first generation graduate. So this is kind of like a problem. The attacks on critical race theory, the attacks on protest and dissent. I mean, which is something that definitely comes and with our rights as scholars, but also as educators in me. And this is what we teach our students to do. And I'm so proud of them that they've been doing that, and we have been supporting it. So I want, I mean, your take in what's happening in Texas. You don't need to speak specifically about UT if you don't want to, but I just want your general impact on this critical race theory ban of books, what's happening in high schools. We know what's happening in history classes here in Texas right now with the whitewashing of even, I mean, the Middle Passage. I mean, we don't learn about students are not learning about the Middle Passage until they get to college and they take intro to African American studies or history classes, and they know about the Middle Passage there. I mean, this is really worrisome in many ways. So your take, Jasmine, you want to start?
I can jump in. I think I'll start with actually saying, you know, even though I'm trained as a social scientist, a quantitative social scientist who's like was always in statistics and used to say, I will probably never be a theorist. I now teach theories of race and ethnicity at the graduate level every year to a class of students where we do history and deep thinking and theory, because making sense of anything, whether it be the quantification of our world or understanding these processes, requires a grounding in history. It demands it. Like we have to. And so when I teach these classes, I feel like I'm in many ways giving them tools, because they are learning to make sense of what is happening. And in fact, they're able to reflect on that. So for example, the specifically the ban on DEI was actually started by Christopher Rufo and the, you know, there's a, what is it called? The, I'm forgetting the name of the, Monica, do you remember the name of the founder?
Manhattan Institute.
The Manhattan Institute. That's what I was trying to remember, the Manhattan Institute. And they created a model legislation that actually suggests we should bring back what they call colorblind ideology, which, I mean, I feel like they need to be reading Eduardo Bonilla Silva, right? Because I thought we tackled this, but no, this isn't, in fact, it never went. It was already always there. And now they've infused this language into the model legislation that ended up being used in Florida, in Texas, and now in many other states to ban diversity, equity, inclusion. And when they say CRT, what they really just mean anything in a very, very long list of words that could mean critical, LGBTQ, anything. Like, I mean, it becomes so broad, it encompasses everything. And it does two things. Number one, it's literally like an erasure, right? A way of control. But another thing it does is, like I said, I feel like my classes are tools for students, right? There's a reason why in the encampments, one of the main things they do are teach-ins, because knowledge is power. Knowing about this history is power. Understanding these ideas and these logics are power. Knowing our history is just knowing it. We don't have to forget ideology. I tell people, I say, do you think I'm indoctrinating students? Shoot, they're getting me. I said, all I gotta do is give them some articles on history and they're putting berets on because they're mad that they didn't know basic history. They are angry they didn't know. They're revolutionary. And I'm like, whoa, okay, hold on a second. I'm getting there. They're like, let's go. And I'm like, okay, I'm there. But this idea that I'm like giving them basic history, that is why we see a lot of this effort to exclude that, because if you don't know this history is a way of understanding and then making sense of what is happening right now. And if you don't have that knowledge, if you don't have that grounding in history, if you don't have an understanding of these politics of the law, I talk about the teachers like critical racial, like legal studies, and we talk about the history of the census and measurement erasure. We talk about, eugenics and science and the biologizing of race, like so that they can make sense of now of this DNA test nonsense and of the CRT bans, and they can make sense of ongoing genocides and apartheid and lots of other things. And that is what people don't want, right? So an attempt of that is to keep people from the very knowledge that allows them to make critical decisions grounded in an understanding of history and a critical understanding of what's happening in the world.
Yes, thank you, Jasmine. So DEI, for those who don't know, is diversity, equity, and inclusion is the acronym for diversity, equity, and inclusion, 3 important pillars of higher ed in the United States that are being attacked by this SB 17 law as we speak. So this is why Jasmine was explaining that teaching history and going to the basics, race, ethnicity, the histories of the Middle Passage, legal history, even critical race theory, which also has been criticized and taken down in the state of Florida in many institutions. And they want to do the same here as well in Texas, since the political decisions are coming from these 2 major Republican actors. So Danielle, yes, go ahead. Thank you, Jasmine.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a couple points I want to make. I think, the first one is that we are certainly under attack. And I think overall, Black folks are under attack, right? This is not to say that everyone else isn't also, right? But I think the main target by many of these politicians, right, are Black folks, Black history, Black activism, Black agency. And so, we're in this space right now, and I'm glad, Yasmin, I'm glad you talked about, right, this colorblindness, because we're in this space right now where colorblindness is being used, right, to change the status quo, right, to kind of cement the inequality that exists right now. And so, as we're listening to these arguments about, race, shouldn't matter, right, and we're all, we should all be judged on merit, right? And all of these arguments that sound very nice, if you don't, right, know the background of these arguments, right, they can be very dangerous, because I think that a lot of folks hear these arguments about merit and think, well, yeah, that sounds right, right? But it's not, right? It's essentially an attack on efforts, right, to improve racial equality. And so, and I think that, I want to kind of take it back to our last conversation, because, it's not unrelated to a lot of the debates that we have about race among Latinos in general. And I've been, on social media a lot, kind of tracking a lot of these conversations, especially when the census question changed. And a lot of folks were saying, well, this is great because now I can just put Latino and they're not dividing us anymore, right? We're all mixed, we're all multiracial, right? Yes, we all, right, have some, right, mix of something, but ultimately how we're being racialized in this society is what we're talking about. And so, along with these colorblind arguments, people will also kind of think about that as far as their own identities are concerned and not want to recognize Blackness or not want to recognize race, right? And it's necessary because we need the tools to be able to challenge a lot of these colorblind arguments that are coming from the right, that are serving to make the argument that, we need merit and not resources, right? And as long as we have racial inequality, we need resources in order to challenge that. And what these states are trying to do, and this is not only a Texas thing, I think a lot of people talk about Texas and Florida, but this is a national movement to try to divest resources that go to marginalized groups. And so we need to really understand that we're under attack, and we need to understand what the tools are that are necessary to really start to fight this. And that's not only right on a national level. As I said, it's also about how we think about our own identities, right? Our own racial differences, and how we are going to, kind of move the needle, right? So that other folks that are maybe also stuck in this color blindness, that are not on the right, are not kind of feeding into these arguments. Because I think that if you don't really pay attention to what's going on, you can be sucked into some of these arguments. And so we have to really push to be able to raise awareness.
Thank you. Monica.
Yeah, I just was looking up because you said reallocation of funds, Danielle, and it made me painfully aware of the way that SB 17, the anti-DEI law, has reallocated funds. And during yesterday's hearing, which Josiana mentioned, the estimate that was given was $25 million reallocated from DEI programs, 311 part-time and full-time positions, and 21 offices were eliminated across the UT system. So not just at UT Austin, but across the entire UT system, across the state of Texas. So those are big numbers, right? $25 million that was taken out of Black students, right? And Latino students and first generation students and queer students, faculty or staff positions that were there to serve those students were gone. And there's some question, and one of the things that was debated in yesterday's hearing was that required, right? It came out that Texas A&M actually didn't close any of their student programs, right? Because they read the law as being exempting students, right? So that, and when I saw that yesterday, my head was going to explode, because we did so much work last year to educate the legislature to the extent that you can educate them, right? Or they would listen to us. But the real ramifications that we're seeing now of these laws, right? And how we knew that they were coming, right? We knew that this would be the ramification, but to now see it in numbers, right? We've seen the kind of human toll because we work with the students, and we know that on our campus, 60 staff lost their jobs, and we know some of those people, right? We've met them, we've heard their stories. So we know the human face of it, but then to get the actual numbers yesterday was pretty startling, right? To know how much money is being reallocated. And, the president of UT, in discussions with all of us at the faculty council meeting, was really sort of trying to tout that, right? Oh, this is money that's going back into your research, right? As a way of sort of selling it to us that this was a good thing. But we know whose research, if it's going to go to research and teaching, whose research is going to be funded. It probably won't be ours, right? So those, I think, are really salient points and really salient questions when we think about the sort of national movement to divest funds from racial justice initiatives, right? And from scholarship initiatives. And we can't forget that this coincides with the Supreme Court's Dobbs decision, not Dobbs, although that was another travesty, right? But the Supreme Court's decision in the UNC students and students at Harvard University, right? That at the same time that these movements are happening at the state level, on the federal level, we now have an inability to consider race in admissions, right? And going hand in hand, right? No longer can we sort of try to rectify the kind of structures that have disallowed students of color to access higher ed. But now, if they make it to higher ed, we've also removed the structures that allow them to succeed, right? And we know there's been many studies that show that it's not enough for students to get to higher ed, right? You have to have the structures in place for them to succeed. And for first generation students, it's a high bar, right? Especially for students who still feel responsibilities at home, right? Where they have to take care of their family members, right? But try to be students. That's a really high bar for those students. And so the offices that we're talking about, they served a really important function. And so that's also something to really think about, right? The way that it's being discussed. The senator in Texas, Creighton, who's a big proponent of DEI, of Senate Bill 17, who introduced it, he was like, well, some people are going to lose their jobs, but that's okay, right? Like he was very dismissive about it. And I was like, it's not just about the jobs lost, though those are people whose lives are deeply impacted, right? It's about all of the things, right, that those jobs represent, which is a community, right, for students and for faculty and staff, right, that serve a real sort of intangible function, right? It doesn't quite quantify in the same way, but it is as important. So that's some of the things that we need to keep in mind when we talk about what's being lost, and how that's going to have really big ripple effects across the years, right? And we're going to see that certainly in Texas and in other places as these laws continue to progress, right? Because they're like mushrooms, they're proliferating all over the country.
Yes. So as part of go ahead, Jasmine.
I just wanted to ask, because speaking of this, UNC Chapel Hill's trustees 2 days ago voted to redirect $2.3 million from DEI funding to policing, specifically around, they said, in light of safety issues from pro-Palestinian protests. So this is like, when it's connected, when we're saying it's connected, it is connected. And we know policing is not for everybody, right? So this is divestment in a different way, right? This is divestment, but it's divestment from the kinds of programs that ensure everyone's included, rather those that are in the dominant group, and redirecting it to the kinds of programs and systemic kind of funding that reinforces dominant group power through things like policing and through unequal funding distribution and resource allocation.
Thank you for adding that. And this is, for those of us who study this phenomena, it's kind of like more of a confirmation, I guess, of what we keep repeating. But it's really eerie and terrible to see it happening in front of our own eyes. Many, not only the networks that a lot of the students had at the university with this staff workers, with a lot of the support that they had was eliminated. Also, many of the students had to support their own graduations, as some of the specific graduations were eliminated as well, the funding to pursue those. So they had to look for the money to support their own events. Once again, when we discuss divestment, as Jasmine very well said, this is pretty much a larger phenomena, as when we discuss abolition and freedom and liberation. Bringing those words to the ground of what we do every day. It's what a lot of what we do comes in. You mentioned, Jasmine and Monica, the three of you talk about very positive, and the way your teaching has changed. Your pedagogical experiences have changed, and you had to kind of like move a lot of the teaching into the times. I was wondering, I'm curious about positive responses of students. I know many of you have, you're amazing mentors, and you work directly with students, not only in African diaspora studies, but in Latin American studies and other programs in education, the School of Social Work, history, anthropology. So you are in, you wear many hats as Afro-Latinx professors of color. So I was wondering, any of those like good experiences in the classroom that you, or with these students that you want to share? I'm just curious about those. Yeah.
I'll share a little something. I'm sorry, Danielle, were you gonna?
No, you go.
So I just was teaching this semester. I mean, it couldn't have been more relevant. It was actually kind of eerie. But I was teaching a class on debt and colonialism in the Caribbean. And we spent a lot of time talking about Haiti, obviously, for obvious reasons, and revolution, right? So we spoke a lot about the Cuban Revolution and the Haitian Revolution. And so we just, I don't know, they were very interested in this question of revolution. We kept coming back to it. And I remember having this discussion in the context of like global capitalism, right? And thinking about what it would take to sort of undo a global capitalist structure, right? Like what would it mean to bring sort of that, to reconsider that structure. And I love to give them these exercises because they and us, right? We are so deeply mired in the way that capitalism structures our lives that we can't even imagine a life without it, right? It's like the atmosphere. It just is, right? So I often ask them like, well, what would a world without capitalism look like? And they just can't. But we were thinking about revolution and anti-capitalism, and my students were like, we can do these things. And I was like, all right, well, we're talking about this here, but revolution is real, right? People engage in revolution all the time in big ways and smalls, and the kind of bottom line is it's uncomfortable, right? You can't have a comfortable revolution, right? You're not going to be sitting at home like eating the best food and in the lap of luxury and shifting the structures of capitalism. It's not going to happen, right? So we can all be armchair revolutionaries, but when it comes time to it, it's going to be ugly, it's going to be uncomfortable, and some people are going to get hurt, right? Like that's just, and I think like the next week, this stuff happened on campus, and it was just this like moment for them to be like, oh, this is what you mean by like, this requires real sacrifice, right? And it's, we can talk about, theorize it and think it and whatever, but when when you see your like classmates on campus who are like, oh, I'm willing to put my body on the line, right? Like I'm willing to do that, to be deeply uncomfortable. And so it was this like, I would not wish it, right? But it was this deeply pedagogical moment where we were really thinking about what does revolution mean and what does it take to undo these massive structures and to speak truth to power, right? And really sort of push against it. And then we had that happen on campus twice, not once, twice, right? And so I think it really was like this moment for them where they a lot of them came up to me or emailed me and were like, oh my God, I like what you're talking about makes a different kind of sense now, right? It's not just about books and ideas, and it's about what we're witnessing, and not just on UT's campus, but across college campuses, right? The fact that students are saying, no, enough of the genocide, like, and I'm willing to put my body and my degree and my potential future employment on the line for it, right? So that's a different type of pedagogical moment that we could not have imagined.
Thank you, Monica. Yes. Danielle or Jasmine?
So I didn't teach an undergraduate class this semester. And so I didn't kind of have that conversation, right, about what was happening on campus. I think for me, one of the best things that I take out of the students, coming to me after the class is that I'm able to teach them about diaspora. And so I think that, we all kind of think about the world in relation to where we grew up, right? So if we grow up in Texas, then that's our perspective, that's our point of view. And we don't know a lot about Caribbeans. We don't know a lot about the Haitian Revolution. We don't know a lot about Blackness outside of certain groups. And so I think that, I had an email actually today from a student who has just graduated, saying thank you because you've taught me about the Black diaspora, right, in a way that I probably never would have had in any other class. And so for me, right, it's like teaching them about Blackness from a completely different perspective is one of the best parts of my teaching, because the way that I approach most of my classes is I talk about the Caribbean and Latin America and the US in the same class. And we think about what are the different ways that people have, engaged in activism? What are the different ways that people think about Blackness? What are the different ways, that, we've seen racial inequality and racial hierarchy, right, affect people's lives? And so in that sense, I really get to kind of open them up to a completely different set of histories, right? Yasmin was saying, about how when she teaches, she'll teach about something and then people will put on berets, right? And, I had a student, come to me and say, I'm so, fascinated with the young lords, and I dressed up as a young lord for Halloween, and, I'm teaching all of my friends about the young lords. And so it was, it's right, these moments where they're realizing, what else has happened in other places around Black and Latino activism, right? And where they fit in all of that is I think really important, because they don't necessarily, with everything that has happened with the K-12 curriculum, they really don't get it. But I think even if we did have, right, a better K-12 curriculum, growing up in a particular place, right, in the United States means that you're not exposed to a lot of other communities and a lot of other histories that make up, right, the Black diaspora.
I also, I think I've had a chance to have a number of moments with the students that have just been very interesting, on top of the fact that they have most definitely brought it to class, because I was teaching sociology of education, where we are thinking about systems, and we talk about institutional legitimacy, and we talk about a divestment. We're talking about the histories and about the evolution. We're talking about neoliberalism and capitalism and the way it's changed education. But we had, it was interesting. So Monica mentioned, I think I had a similar thing where my students are like very quick to be like, here's the solution to educational inequality. And I had to have a reckoning with them of, number one, are you going to give up your comfortable seat in this classroom for that? And let's have a conversation about what this means in reality, when we have a system that rests on very few people having a lot and very many people having nothing. And like, what does it mean to actually think about these changes in that system? And can you within a system like that? Which pushed them, I was really trying to think about, like, how do you push to think beyond just this kind of like, I'm going to create a program and it's going to do this X thing to save X community. And I'm like, but I think beyond that, the other thing that's been interesting is just being able to bridge. So a lot of my work bridges like these, like, philosophy and critical theory with folks that are in areas where they never get to touch any of that. And so I know that this wasn't this semester, but last semester, which I think dovetailed into what has been happening this semester, because that was literally the started last semester in terms of the pro-Palestinian of movement on campus and kind of activism starting around that, is I was like teaching racial theory, and I was able to see people connect these ideas to areas that they normally wouldn't think about. Like, I had people that were in STEM education talking about ethnic studies math. I had people asking about multiracial coalition building in the Black Panther movement. They were like, were anybody other than Black people in the Black Panther movement? I was like, actually, yes, let's talk about that. And I was able to talk about its connections to and what that means now in terms of coalition building and movements. I was able to talk about these connections. And they posed those kinds of questions. They were digging in, and they were also like, oh, these things that I'm learning are not separate from what I'm doing in science and mathematics and technology. They're not separate from what I'm doing in education. They're not separate from what I'm doing in sociology. In fact, they're like implicated, and they're embedded. It's deeply connected, and that I can do these things and will probably do them better, and will understand them better by making these kinds of connections. And so they were, last semester in particular, making a lot of connections to what was going on in the moment with, this kind of like movement into divestment out of like DEI and the what was happening in terms of even thinking about Black and Asian like coalition building around like Stop Asian Hate and like all this kind of like very interesting, which is like things are moving so fast we forgot, and that was last semester we were doing that because now we're doing other things, even though those things are still also going on because it's that chaotic, but they're deeply connected. And for them to see those connections into like, they wasn't just me pointing out, they were the ones digging in to them and asking about these things in class, because you could see them really starting to understand like, oh, part of the reason the system works like this is because we think science is somehow separate. It's somehow so objective and so positive, so, you know, neutral and merit-based, that it's totally disconnected from the history of racism that literally buttresses its development, its history, and the history of race and racism. So like making those connections were really, I think, important. And I appreciated that they did that in the class and saw them make those connections and take that with them.
Wonderful. Thank you all. I ended my set of questions. So we are now going to open up to questions from the audience. So if you have your questions, please write them down. The panelists are here. We will be taking questions in the last minutes here, and then we are going, after answering our questions, we're going to wrap up and close our conversation for today. So please write them down. Anything you want to ask, we're here. I'm glad that I asked about this positive moments in the classroom. This semester was difficult. I mean, at least for me, in some of my courses, I had there's always that student who gets very resistant, and you want to negotiate and discuss and talk to that student, but it's always a pedagogical, exercise to kind of like discuss many of these ideas, because it's I mean, you have students from all walks of life and experiences. And this is the specific particularity of Texas, is that it's such a large state, that you have pretty much diverse communities everywhere. So are there questions, comments? Okay, yes. So there's a question coming in about recommendations, and thank you for this question. It's excellent. What are some of the recommendations for Afro-Latinx and Afro-Latinas in particular to implement in terms of organizing and resisting? Particularly, I imagine that they're asking about this present moment with the protests against the war and the genocide in Palestine. But also in general, I mean, resistance and organization in relation to community. And there's another interesting question related to that from Marta about divestment and this vital information that we share about what's happening with DEI, but also divestment in general. How can we share it in our communities? I mean, I guess that we discuss it here, but it's not information that appears openly, I imagine, everywhere. So
can I
Yes.
just, I think I can weave this into the recommendations, but I felt like I wanted to mention it and I've forgotten when we were talking about the pedagogical things. I think one of the things that I've seen develop among my students and in these kind of activism moves is this ethic of care that is really so central, that I'm constantly moved by the amount of care for each other. Students, faculty, staff, everyone is kind of like in these movements, and the importance of that, because there were moments where I was tired, where I could not be present, but being able to take care of myself in moments made it possible to be present in other moments. And the moments where I was present mattered. But also having people checking on me and going, did you get that nap you needed? Like, are you okay? Even I remember walking to campus and having students just stop me like, are you okay? and also caring for each other in these ways that really moved me, because all of this is so violent, and we're constant, and there really is this, when it's like this resistance that demands, in essence, that one put themselves and their body and their livelihoods and their lives on the line. But in that, there's also joy and love and care, and there's been an immense amount of that on our campus and in Austin and in Texas and around the country. And we've seen that happen with people sharing food, with people coming cooking for encampments, with folks celebrating each other when they go to testify and they sit there all night, right? And watching, and with also just checking in with each other and making sure that we make space within this movement for that. And these are the way we sustain movements, because we can't sustain movements only through constant force, because we need rest and care and love even in the midst of all this, because we're still living, right? We're still in the world living, we're still teaching, we're still with families, we're still caring for people. So
Thank you, Jasmine.
I want to jump in. I love that,
Yes,
Yasmin. I think
beautiful.
that we often forget that we are bodies with finite capacities, even in our desire to do all the things and be everything to all of our community. So I echo that, the need to care, and knowing that too is a type of activism, right? That we often think if you're not at the protest, or if you're not, in the meeting, if you're not, then you're not participating, but that there are all these ways that we need the community to participate. I want to offer, I think, as our students are modeling for us, right? The effectiveness and the radicality of teach-ins, right? To the question of how can we share this information, and also how do we organize as Afro-Latinx, right? And I think that is, we here obviously are in the business of education, but all of us can be teachers, right? And all of us who see injustice, my partner likes to say that his Baba once told him, if you see the problem, it's yours to solve, right? Like if you see, then you need to be the one to find the solution. If there's not already a solution there, right? It's yours to at least begin to solve, right? And so I think that that's part of how we sort of bring these conversations into communities where they might not be quite so apparent or in the open, right? Is to sit down and have conversations with people in a respectful way, to do collective readings together, right? To say, you know what, I might not know enough to teach anyone, but I could sit in community with a group of people, and we can read this book, or we could read this short essay, or there are all these great sort of syllabi around topics about, various things, but there is one around that I've seen a couple of times around what's happening in Gaza right now, right? If this is something that's really concerning to you, but you don't yet understand it fully, sit down with your community and have a reading group, right? And that is a way of continuing those conversations. And from that, right, who knows what sort of other organizing comes about, right? Because when you begin that dialogue, what you realize is you start to recognize what your community needs, right? And what your community needs is always connected to what other communities need. And then, we see the kind of, again, mushrooming, because I think that's a great analogy, right? Of interconnected sort of dialogues. So I think the students in this moment are really leading the way, right? And saying, like, we need to be talking about, what does it mean? What does liberation mean, right? What does decolonization mean? What do these freedom struggles teach us? And so we could all sort of learn from the way that they're teaching each other, and calling on experts to teach them, right? Because we've all been asked too, can you come and sit with us and, do a teach-in about X, Y, and Z for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, whatever it is. And I think we all have that capacity in our communities that we can pull from.
Yes, there was a note about praising our students for their courage and commitment to liberation and struggle. They're leading the way, and a lot of these teachings and communication and care and community care are kind of like offering another view of the university, right? A university without walls, a kind of like open space in which having us together as communities kind of like offers a more sense of what we want to do than having us, separated from the community. So I think I saw something. Of course, Loria Garcia Peña has been working on this for many, many years. But Princeton started like some teachings. Also in Colombia, they have been happening. And I see that as also another way to go. Danielle, you wanted to say something to close and wrap up?
I'll just say very quickly that I think that it's really important to keep going, because I think that what a lot of administrations are hoping at this point is that, oh, well, the summer is here, right? The graduation fiascos, right, have ended, and now we can continue, right, with these policies that we want to push through. And so I think that it's really important to make sure that people are still fighting, people are still resisting, people are still making noise, because ultimately we're being tested. We're being tested as these policies come through to see what we'll accept and what we won't accept. And if we accept anything, or we only make a small fuss about it, then they'll say to themselves, well, then I can go even further with this, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that, it's really important, right? Taking into account rest, right? And self-care and taking care of each other, taking shifts, right? But to keep going. Because if we stop making noise, then, right, it's seen as a tacit acceptance of, right, what has happened, even if we don't like it. And so it's really important to keep fighting.
Yes, agreed. Thank you, Danielle. Thank you, Jasmine. Thank you, Monica. And we have now Marta Moreno Vega coming in. Marta, go ahead.
Thank you. I can't say thank you enough, Monica, Danielle, Josiana. It's just so vital, the information that you have shared with us. Just vital, because we forget the struggles that we have gone through before, right? And we see ourselves seeing them again and again, right? And they try to be erased. And it's on us. It's on us to do the work, to make sure that our communities are informed, that we are clear on the narrative. And you have provided narrative that's just very clear and very direct in terms of how we should move forward. And no, we don't stop, as Danielle has said. We don't stop. We continue. And we have never stopped. So that you have inspired us. Your words have given us direction. And the reason we call the series Absolutamente Negro, Negra, Negrex, is because we can't be fuzzy about our identification. As Yasmin has said, really on point. We are Black, and if you own it, own it. Don't fuzz with it. So thank you so much for sharing your information, your knowledge, and most of all, your love and caring for us. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Buenas tardes, and wonderful to see you.
Yes, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Marta. Thank you to the Creative Justice Initiative.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you.